welcome Steve Hahn to our flagship studio at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. Steve is the CEO of Harbinger Health, a company that is pioneering the detection of early cancer using a blood test. And Harbinger is pairing a unique insight into the biology of cancer's origins with powerful technology to do that. And Steve's going to tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you for being here, Steve.
Well, Lindy, thank you, and thanks to Flagship for the opportunity.
Happy to. So tell us a little bit about Harbinger and what makes it unique. We've heard a lot about blood-based cancer tests, a lot of excitement for it, but also some skepticism. What makes what Harbinger is doing unique?
So we are unique in a couple aspects. One is we're developing a platform for a series of tests. We call it across the cancer continuum. So certainly screening for cancers to find cancers, but also how do we monitor and how do we look for recurrence of disease, et cetera. So we have a platform that is based upon a biology that is we've been talking about in cancer, and I was a cancer doctor, as you know, for 40 years. And that is this relationship between developmental biology in the placenta and what happens in cancer. And so this signature is seen in both. And what it allows us to do is to detect cancers at a very early stage. Precancerous conditions, so before it becomes a malignancy, but then stage 1 and 2. So we're pretty good in oncology at detecting stage 3 and 4 disease where it's more difficult to treat and frankly, more expensive. But we're not so good at detecting many of these cancers at stage 1 and 2. And that's the power of the biology. We then combine that with issues around when you get a test back, what's the doctor going to do?
Sure.
And is it actually indicative of having a cancer? Those are current problems with screening right now. The false positives, if you will, but also the cost and the access issues associated with that. And we have a proprietary approach to our technology that will allow us to address all of those issues. So if you think about it, for cancer screening, we are trying to address all the problems that are associated with cancer screening and really bring it into the forefront. And I'll end with one thing in that I adore my grandkids. I want a world when my grandkids get to that age where they're getting this blood test or a blood test like it, just like they would be screened for hypertension, cholesterol, and diabetes, so that we can detect it and it becomes a disease not to fear.
So that would be a really different world than the one we live in today.
For sure.
Steve, tell us a little bit about this two-tier model that I've heard you talk about before. What does that mean, and how does that change what is available today and address some of the challenges that you've been talking about?
Well, one of the features of the blood-based cancer screening approach is that people are trying to approach it with one test.
Okay.
And the problem when you take one test, we learned this during COVID. If you were trying to screen people for COVID and they didn't have symptoms, you ran into troubles with the performance of the test. So if you're trying to screen a population who has a very low but still finite risk of cancer, you run into problems like poor positive predictive value, high false positives, et cetera. So we have developed a proprietary approach. We just got issued a patent on this from the U.S. Patent Office that allows us to use a multi-tier approach. An upfront test that is very inexpensive can be used across the population and has a high negative predictive value, meaning if it's negative, we can really be sure it's negative, you don't have cancer. And then if it's not negative, you flip to the second test, which is a more detailed NGS-based test that gives a lot more information and will be able to tell us not only, yeah, you have cancer, but where's the cancer located? And so the analogy I use for people is it's like mammogram.
Yeah.
When a woman gets a screening mammogram, that has a very high sensitivity and negative predictive value. But if it's positive, we're not telling a woman she has breast cancer. What we're saying is come back. Get the screening, the additional tests that you need, maybe even a biopsy. It is exactly the same thing. And we are uniquely positioned to exploit the biology for the betterment of people using this two-tier technique.
Okay, that's really interesting. So Harbinger is unique in the flagship ecosystem in that you're working on a test rather than a therapeutic. And in that world, the timelines are much shorter. So 2024, I think you have a lot going on. Tell us about what to expect from Harbinger over the next 12 or so months, and where will the company be moving towards over the next year?
You bet. So I'll start with a little statistic. Approximately 85% of new cancer drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration last year had a companion or some sort of diagnostic part of their label. That's really important because what that tells you is that diagnostics are a critical part of taking care of cancer patients in the future. And the world is very complicated and getting more so. So we really have to be able to help that, not just on the screening side, but the other parts of our platform. But if you look at what we're doing right now, we're in the middle of a prospective study. And I'm really excited about where we are. Our preliminary data look very, very good. And I'm anxious to see the more definitive data come out of this. And of course, this trial is going to help us develop this multi-tier testing program and eventually launch a product in 2025. So we expect over this next year the full definitive readout from the trial. We're going to use a very data-driven approach to determine what are the products that we want to come out of the platform, knowing that there may be 100 products that come out over 10 to 15 years, but what will we commercialize first?
Okay.
And we'll use the data from this trial to do that, as well as market research that we're doing that tells us what is the market, what are providers and patients and payers ready for. So all those will go into that, and you can expect to hear about that from us next year, or this year.
It'll be an exciting year for sure.
For sure.
Steve, one of the topics that I know is very close to you personally, but also to Harbinger across the board, and one of the reasons why you joined the company is access. So a lot of the cancer screening tools that we have today, whether they be blood-based or imaging, just aren't accessible to people. So how is Harbinger addressing that challenge, both through the technology and also your thoughts around commercialization?
Well, I'll personalize it a little bit. When I left the Food and Drug Administration and came to Flagship, two big observations from the pandemic. One was the importance and the power of the private sector to help us solve really important health-related problems. I mean, if you didn't learn that from COVID, you're probably never going to learn that one. And the second one was we absolutely have to do something about healthcare disparities. And it's a moral imperative that we cannot leave people behind. People got left behind during COVID. And worse yet, with cancer screening, the people who got left behind in COVID got further left behind in cancer screening. And they're the folks who usually present with the more advanced disease and have the lower life expectancy. We absolutely have to do something about it. It can't be prohibitively expensive. We have to work with payers to get it paid for, and we have to make it easy. So you probably know in the cancer screening world, although mammography is pretty well taken up by American women, there's still 30% of American women who are eligible who don't get it. The number is even higher for colonoscopy.
I bet.
And for CT scan of the chest for high-risk folks. So a blood-based test where we can go to your home and actually get that done and have it be inexpensive, terrific way
Big
to
deal.
increase the access. So we're approaching it by very much focusing on cost. For that tier 1 test, we want it to be low cost, as well as high negative predictive value. The second thing is in our clinical studies, we are very focused on diversity. Now, I'm talking about diversity writ large because think about the people who got left behind. There's certainly a race and ethnicity component to that, but there's also a socioeconomic. And they're the folks who trust us the least. So we're spending a lot of time, as you know, talking about how we can reach communities that don't normally hear from us before we have a test that goes out there to say, hey, come participate with us. This is something we'd like to tell you about and participate in the study. So we're working at it from a number of different angles, but it is an important corporate principle, this issue of access, particularly around cost and the ability to do this in a decentralized manner.
Fantastic. So Harbinger has in mind a very different world than the one that we live in today, where testing for cancer could happen with a blood test. It could happen very early on in the disease process, and it could be much more accessible than it is today. It sounds really exciting. Steve, thank you for sharing more about it with us.
Thank you, Lindy. Really appreciate the opportunity.